Well, welcome to Surge's webinar, Knowing God's Strength in Your Weakness, with our featured speaker, Dr. Eric McLaughlin. We're so glad that you're with us. My name is Patrick Kinneck, and I'm going to be your host today. I'm also the Area Director for Renewal at Surge. And for those of you who maybe haven't heard about Surge before, we're a cross-denominational mission sending agency, and we believe that the power of the gospel at work in our own lives is really what compels us to leave family and friends and go out on mission. As we go out on mission, we actually discover that we need God's grace even more than we thought that we did. And so at Surge, that type of work expresses itself through sending missionaries who do three primary things. We have missionaries who work to reach all people through evangelism and church planting. We have missionaries who work to renew all believers through gospel-centered teaching and training, publications that we use to mentor other Christian leaders. And we have missionaries who work in works of justice, mercy, business for transformation to restore all of God's creation. So some of those resources that we'll be featuring, one of them today, Eric's book, Promises in the Dark. Surge has also released 4 other new publications this last year. For all of our publications, you can always go to surge.org to find out what they're about. Small group resources with the Mission-Centered Life, Jonah and Ruth, and then just for teens edition of a study on Mark. So surge.org is where you can go to find all the latest for those. A few housekeeping items as we get started. There will be a back and forth question and answer session with our speaker, Eric. You can submit questions through the Q&A function in your menu bar. In your menu bar, if you see a feature that says raise hand or chat, we're not going to use those functions today, so you don't need to worry about them. And friendly reminder, because people always kind of want to know, while you can see Eric and I, we can't see you, and none of the other participants can see you either. So without any further ado, let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Eric McLaughlin. Eric is one of Surge's missionary physicians, and he specializes in family medicine. He and his wife, Rachel, who is also a medical doctor, and their 3 children live at Kabuye Hope Hospital in the small African country of Burundi, where they care for patients while training African doctors through Hope Africa University. And Eric is also the author of a book, Promises in the Dark, Walking with those in Need Without Losing Heart. So Eric, welcome. It's fantastic to have you here. And as we get started, I would love to have you just tell our listeners a little bit more about life and work in Burundi. What does that look like for you?
Thanks, Patrick. Good to be talking with you. And thanks to everyone who's come out for the webinar. So a little bit of background about me. My wife, Rachel, and I and our 3 kids, we live here in Burundi. We've been here since 2013, and we've been in Africa since 2009, so a little over 10 years. And the book stories are kind of crossed between when we lived in Kenya, and then after moving to Kenya, we joined with Surge and we moved to Burundi. So Burundi is located where you can see on the picture there. It's one of those countries that is always good to have a visual aid to remind people or to inform people, as it usually is, where it's located. A small country, but a rather populous country, about 11 million people, a very beautiful and rich culture, lovely green hills and highlands climate, also a very broken country in a lot of ways, with a lot of war in its history and a lot of poverty and need at present. So what the Surge team here is primarily doing is we are serving as support for the Hope Africa University Medical School. So Hope Africa University is a Burundian-run university, church-run university that was founded in the early part of the 21st century, and they've had a medical school since 2007. A country needs doctors, but they don't have many doctors to make doctors, and so that's part of why we're here. So we live several hours away from the main campus of the university at a rural hospital in kind of the middle of nowhere, where we take care of patients that come from all over the country, including surrounding countries, on a daily and weekly basis, providing care, but also using that setting of providing care as the setting where we're teaching scores of medical students, as well as nursing and other health professionals. So we're we're teaching, we're giving courses, we're treating patients, we're working to develop the hospital more and more into kind of an African teaching hospital, discipling trainees. So, and every once in a while, as one of the photos that you can see there, I get to put on a fairly interesting purple hat, and there's an accompanying purple gown, which is incredibly flamboyant, and I get to go and walk down at graduation with our new graduates. In fact, this picture was from a couple of years ago, but I just did it again last Friday. We went down, and Hope Africa University graduated 92 new medical doctors, which for a country in 2010 that had about 300 doctors in the whole country, it was a real joy to be a part of that, and to see the impact that the university is making, and to be able to be a part of all the. So that's in a nutshell, I guess, what we do here.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Christianity Today had a recent article that talked about the new face of medical missions in Africa, and it was exactly the people. Some of our surge team were quoted in the article, but it's Africans who are being trained largely by Western missionaries who are coming, who are living on site to provide the sort of access to education training that would be really hard to come by otherwise, but then empowering them to really carry out and sustain medical and patient care in the years and decades ahead.
Right, and education. And in that article, the first guy that was mentioned there was a graduate of our university who went to Gabon for 5 years and trained with missionaries there to become a surgeon. And now he is not only working for us at the hospital and providing care, but he's one of the professors. He's educating, he's directing, he's teaching. And so, we open a door, and there's a world of good, hardworking talent that is walking through it and taking more and more leadership roles. And it's a joy to be a part of that.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Could you tell us just a little bit, like if we came to visit you, you said Kabuye is out in the countryside, what would we see kind of as we drove up to the hospital? What would that be like for an outsider coming for the first time?
Yeah, so outsiders coming from outside the country would go through the only commercial airport in the capital city, and Bujumbura, which is down on a very large lake, and you can see the Congolese mountains across the lake. And it's generally fairly hot and fairly humid all the time. And as soon as you drive out of the city, you climb for a good hour up to about 7,000 to 8,000 feet altitude. And these guys, there's a picture up there about a guy with about 200 kilos of bananas strapped to the back of his little bike there. And on the way up, you would see him holding on to the back of a very slow-moving semi-truck. But on the way down, he would be just zooming down at about 45 to 50 miles an hour. It's a terrifying experience to watch them with all of his bananas and his bike. So you climb until you get into a nice, cool, green, hilly country, and then continue for several more hours until you get where we are. Where we are, there's no appreciable town around where we are. It's really a series of homes, and for people who work in the hospital, there's the hospital itself, there's a church, and there's a primary school that's there. And so it's a little bit unexpected to come across this rather large institution development kind of in the middle of nowhere. But then you walk into the hospital, and it's about a 300 and, well, it's under construction right now, so let's call it a 300 bed hospital at present. So full of about 300 hospitalized patients at a time, plus scores of people that are coming in to get treatment for various things. So yeah, I wish I could show you a bunch more pictures, but hopefully that gives at least a little bit of a mental sketch. We now have electricity. Some of the things that I kind of tell in the stories, absence of water and absence of electricity, and we lived with that for several years, and we're thankful at present to have more access to electricity and water now. So the power would be on if you came right now. Thus, I'm having a conversation with you from rural Burundi.
Yeah, well, we're grateful for the power, and we're grateful because we want to hear more about the book. So let's go ahead and turn into that a little bit. And the topic, sure. Even though the book covers a lot of different things, the topic that we really kind of settled on was knowing God's strength in your weakness, and that's one of the central themes that you explore. So I'd love to get you to read a little bit from the book, a little bit of what you've written on that topic. In particular, the real life stories really stand out, as a way of kind of both painting the picture of what life is like there, but also, just kind of how do we come, what do we do when we come face to face with our own insufficiency and inability. So why don't I turn it over to you and let you read an excerpt or two for us?
Sure. Yeah, I've had many opportunities to encounter my own weakness, and so um, lots of stories, but I'll share some of the ones from the book here. So this first story is coming from the very first weekend that I was on call in Kenya. So when I had first moved there, and they put me on call for the pediatric service for the weekend. I'm walking up to the hospital at 7 o'clock in the morning. Rachel is holding our baby, gives me a thumbs up as I head out the door, down the sidewalk, through the walking gate, up the rutted road, up some stairs, through the back hospital entrance. I have my day planned out. I'll head straight to the NICU, start seeing newborns, and then at 9 o'clock, I'll go down to the ward where my intern will have finished seeing the older kids. We'll round, we'll drink some chai, and we'll return to the NICU and see the rest of the babies. Being home for lunch seems very possible. My plan lasts for about 10 minutes. While seeing my first baby in the NICU, the overnight nurse comes over to me to talk to me about the two sickest babies. The first one is a premature baby who's having difficulty breathing. Okay, this doesn't look good, but we have her on our most aggressive oxygen therapy. I'm pretty sure we're doing all that we can. Second baby is a full-term baby brought in overnight for severe jaundice. And this is worrisome because when a baby gets extremely yellow, he can develop a problem in the brain that acts a lot like bad meningitis. The baby doesn't feed, rigid body, seizures, coma, death. It's scary and it's rare, but that's what this baby has. The baby's already under aggressive light therapy. It doesn't seem that we can do any more than that. I was thinking the baby needs an exchange transfusion, says the nurse. Exchange transfusion, I'm familiar with this procedure and its use in a case like this. I've never seen it done, and it hasn't entered my mind that it's something that we could do at this hospital. And when I say we, I guess I mean me. So over the next several hours, I contact 7 of my doctor friends, pulling each of them out of their well-deserved restful weekend to give me their input. 2 of them actually put on their coats and hike it up to the hospital to help me out. During all this time, the little baby with the difficulty breathing dies. Several hours later, I get down to the ward apologizing to the intern for being late, but he doesn't mind, since he's been busy trying to take care of a 3-year-old with HIV and tuberculosis that we've been trying to save. She's just died. It's noon, no patients have been seen, and 2 kids have died. Keep going. Just keep going. Talk with the family whose child has just died. Pray with them. The other children still need to be seen. Keep going. 8 o'clock that night, I'm sitting on a stool in the NICU next to the final incubator, a broken clipboard on my lap, writing my final note. Sun's been down for a while, but it's still warm. I'm gonna have to get up in the morning and do this all over again. During the night, they call me. I head up to the hospital. The jaundice baby has died. In the morning, another one dies. Later, during Sunday rounds, another. 5 children die within 48 hours. And I won't tell all the stories. To be honest, I don't even remember all the stories, but I do remember that for each one, when my hand touched their little body for the last time, I would pray to commit this little child into God's hands. And each time, it got a little harder to continue to believe in the subtle and powerful mystery that we proclaim as the goodness of God. God, why is this happening? God, no more, please. God, I believe you're good. Please show me. I need to see it. These kids, these families, we need to see it. There's so much death. How can I keep going? So that story can be summed up by saying sometimes when we are encountering a weakness, it's because it is too much. There is just too much for anyone that surrounds us. It's too overwhelming for us, but for anything that you could expect a human being to handle. And sometimes when I talk to people about that, the usual go-to is people process it as well. At least you did all that anyone can do, and that's true. And that's a comfort, a partial comfort in situations like this. And so here's the second story, which demonstrates sometimes that's not necessarily what happens either. I remember Mercy. 5 months later, after my first call weekend, I'm less of a novice. I start finding a certain rhythm in hospital life. Visitors now come and ask me where the bathroom is, and I can successfully direct them. The grim realities of the hospital seem a little less piercing, and I'm trying to remember that no one can ask me to do the impossible. I can only do what is possible in my circumstances. So now I'm taking care of adults in the hospital. Mercy is 35 years old. She has at least two little kids. I've seen them around visiting their mom, but odds are good that she has more children at home. Mercy comes in with trouble breathing, and a chest x-ray shows that her heart is huge. And the hospital staff and I decide that she has heart failure, and we start giving her medicine to get the fluid off her lungs. But she just isn't doing well. Something doesn't seem to fit, and after a couple of weeks of floundering, Mercy's left leg swells up. And that changes everything. If a leg is swollen from a big blood clot, then the trouble breathing is probably due to bits of that clot breaking off and lodging in the lungs' blood vessels. And now it seems that even if Mercy's heart is bad, it's not the cause of her problem, and our treatment isn't going to help her. Mercy tells me that she's had this kind of problem before, a couple of years ago. She didn't think it was important enough to tell me when she came in, and I didn't ask. So we hurry to start her on the appropriate treatment, and 3 days later, she gets up to walk to the bathroom, collapses, and dies. And maybe if we had started the treatment sooner for her blood clot, she would have lived. Maybe not, but maybe. And it's hard. She was young. She left at least two little kids.
Okay, so for our participants, Eric's internet has frozen here a little bit, which definitely can happen when you're going intercontinental to get Eric on the call with us here. So let me, we'll wait for a second and see if the internet lag can come back up. Remind you quickly that you do have a chance to submit questions, and assuming we get Eric back, he'd be happy to answer some of those questions. I think one of the things that really stands out to me through the stories, these and other stories in Eric's book, is that we all deal with times of insufficiency and weakness. You know, Eric is writing from a very particular point of view, a medical doctor working in rural conditions in Africa. But, you know, myself as a pastor, we all have people, places, situations in our life where we are insufficient for what is happening in those people's lives. It's beyond our ability really to step in and to move into those sorts of situations. So, you know, regardless of where you find yourself, you know, if you're medical, in a helping profession, counselor, care, first responder, or even just friends who are going through the difficulties, part of what Eric is doing is helping us see, gosh, in the most extreme sorts of circumstances, where is God? What is he doing? How does he connect with us? How does he prove himself to be sufficient for us, even in the midst of those? So our tech people are working feverishly behind the scenes to help Eric get back up here. We do have a game plan, so I'll chat with you for a little bit more. If we're not able to get Eric back in the next 5 minutes or so, probably what we'll do is we'll reschedule the webinar so that we can hear directly from Eric. Friendly reminder as well that we're recording the webinar. We'll send out a link to that afterwards, assuming that we can get him back. If not, and we do have to re-record the webinar, we'll do that. We have your email addresses. We'll let you know when it is, but we'll also send you a link to the recording. So one of the things that we're hoping to have Eric talk about when he comes back is some of our responses to insufficiency. And so I'm gonna save that for him, assuming that we can actually get him to join us. Let me take care of a little bit of housekeeping though, while we have some spare time here. You will get an email at the end or later on this week, and it will either have a link to the recording from this webinar or let you know how to sign up to see it if we have to do it again, or a link to the recording that we do. There'll also be advertisement for our next webinar, which is going to be on Monday, March 23rd at 1 p.m. Paul Miller is going to be doing that with us. Paul is the executive director of an organization called See Jesus, and he'll be sharing from his book, J-Curve, Dying and Rising with Jesus in Everyday Life. And look at that. I see that we do have Eric back with us. So welcome back, Eric.
You only guess what happened, Patrick. Our electricity, I spoke a little too soon, and we'll see what happened. But there we go. At the penultimate moments of my story here, I believe we got cut off from each other.
Yeah, that's right about where it is. So can you just finish up the story with Mercy, or had we gotten to the end of that?
We haven't quite got to the end of it. Let me just finish.
Okay, please do.
It's hard. She was young. She left at least 2 little kids motherless. She spoke to me each day in English, and she felt like sort of a friend. Now Mercy's gone, and maybe if she had had a better doctor, if I had been a better doctor, she would still be here. There's comfort in knowing that you did everything that anyone could have done. This is true, but I'm not at all sure that that's the case for Mercy and me. I want it to be true. I tried to make it true. Just not sure. I know God hasn't called me to get it right every time. He's called me to get up again for another day and do the best that I can with the gifts that he's given me. This also is true, and this also is a comfort. But in the face of all my weakness, sometimes it feels like a pretty small one.
Yeah. So, Eric, I was saying while you were offline there that one of the things that's so poignant about those stories is the way that they really emphasize all of us come to places where we find ourselves insufficient kind of for the situation, for what God has called us into, and needing in some ways to find a new way to rely and rest on Jesus to carry us through in those situations. So talk to us a little bit, in light of those stories and others like them, what have you been learning about facing insufficiency?
Yeah, so I guess the first lesson for me, or the thing that I've thought a lot about, is sort of the inevitability of facing our insufficiencies. I've never felt so weak and insufficient in my life. It's kind of moving to Africa, but it highlights the fact that this isn't like a new thing. This isn't something I wasn't encountering every day of my life up until my time of living here. The question of how do we face it, I've as the kind of the slide can demonstrate, I think that the kind of put our categories into 2 ways in which in the world we normally face these things, and then kind of a radical biblical alternative to those. The first one is to become more sufficient. So I'm weak. Let's mitigate or eliminate the weakness. So I don't have skill set A. I don't know what to do about it. I'm going to go and work to get that skill set. I'm going to try harder, get further training, etc. And those are good things. When we can do them, they are to be lauded. I've spent a lot of time in my life trying to become more sufficient in the things, and I continue to do so every day, trying to learn new things and bring them to bear on the setting that I'm in. The challenge with that is that this doesn't make weakness go away. There will always be, it doesn't matter how many different ways in which we become better and more sufficient, we will still be face to face on a fairly regular basis with things that we cannot do. Because the situations are just too much for anyone, or because the situations are too varied that we can't possibly have been prepared for all of them. So then we can go, and the second coping mechanism facing our insufficiencies would be to pretend that we're sufficient. So this is something that we wouldn't be doing on a conscious level for the most part. So we would have to be pretending to ourselves as well as to other people. We face a problem where there's a weakness and a lack in what we need, and we can shift the blame to someone else. It's not because I'm not handling it sufficiently, it's because someone else isn't. We see others' insufficiencies and magnify them more than our own. Or we pretend that everything's okay in the situation and ignore the lack that's there. So I think most of the time in the face of these things, to try to grapple with what's before us. I mean, I guess the third alternative would be become floridly depressed. That would be another one. I don't have that on the slide, but it's hard to face these things. And so we're looking for some kind of way to deal with it. And I think these are kind of the 2 main categories of how we would think of approaching and tackling the problem that's there. So
Yeah.
what does the New Testament say? And when I say it's, I think it's very blatant in the New Testament, but throughout the Bible, this third alternative of God's power is made perfect in our weakness, which I think is really radical. It's not an answer that we would have come up with on our own. It's so painful. We would have never wanted to come up with this on our own. So I've chosen this passage here in 2 Corinthians 12 is not the only place that the Bible discusses this theme, but it's a very nice, succinct way of putting it together. It's a bit of a strange passage in Paul's letters. He's not really prone to a lot of sort of mystical experiences, but for Paul in this case starts talking about how he's had the context for this passage is the Apostle Paul talking about these surpassing visions and caught up in the third heaven, and then it sort of switches into this little story where it says, to keep me, Paul, from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about it, that it should leave me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then I'm content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong.
Mm. Are you still with us, Eric, or have you paused again? Okay, so Eric's either having some connectivity or some electrical problems. So we'll see if we can get him back. The thing I was thinking when he was reading that verse was, this idea of weakness and insufficiency. It's not limited to, obviously Eric's a medical professional, but there's so many things in my own life where I feel weak and insufficient to be able to step into those. And that idea that God's power is really perfected in our weakness, that's really part of his plan. I tend to think of weakness as something in me, or dependence is something really to be rooted out, overcome, cover it over, ignore it, forget about it, do anything you can so that there's not an emphasis on that. And that really is contrary to part of the way that God intends to work and bring about redemption in our world. Is it's not just that he is working despite our weakness, or it's not just that he is saying, well, there's a lot of weakness, there's a lot of insufficiency out there, but I'm not going to let it stop me. I'm still going to be able to do my thing. Is that it's really part of his plan to work through those things so that his power is displayed, and so that his glory is displayed as well. So, that was, as Eric was talking in terms of the stories that he was telling earlier, I was, in my own heart, I was connecting that with things like parenting, ability to be, a good spouse, good friend. Several folks in my life currently are walking through difficult health struggles. All of those are places where I feel very insufficient, very weak, very unable to, carry on or really know what to do to be helpful. And so just that reminder that God is not just working despite those things, but it's part of his plan to shape me to become more like Jesus, to put me in those situations where clearly I am not enough and where clearly only he can be sufficient. All right, so our tech folks are working hard again to get Eric back up. Could be a power issue on his end, and if that's the case, we might just have to call it. Eric has done such a great job in the book. We definitely want to be able to hear more from him and some of the themes that are in there. Thanks to you who are submitting questions. I'm seeing those coming in. Got some great questions as well. Oh, hey, look, they were able to get Eric back. So we'll keep going. We'll do the best we can, and hopefully we'll be keep you on the line until we finish up here. So Eric,
Right.
I was just telling the folks, and this is a comment that you made to me in part of our prep, was that God doesn't just work in spite of our weaknesses, but it's part of his plan to work in and through our weaknesses. And, you know, how that's really kind of demonstrated in some of the things that you write about over and over again. So, you know, talk to us a little bit more about that. How is God glorified in our weakness?
Right. So the adjective there of God being glorified despite rather than in our weakness, or the preposition, sorry, is significant to me, because as long as God is glorified despite our weakness, then there's this sense of this would be greater. Fine, that's a comfort, but it would be that much better if I didn't have this weakness to deal with. Whereas what the passage actually says, that God is glorified in our weakness, the point is God making Paul weak. He says repeatedly, twice in verses 7 and 8, to keep me from becoming conceited in that case, which gives a little bit of a hint as to how God does this some. But if you look throughout biblical stories, the rest of the Corinthian letters, the life of Jesus looks very weak in a lot of ways. Gideon's army, God purposely gets it down so that no one would be able to glory in themselves, but people would praise God. So no one is going to praise this great webinar because God has let the power go out twice. And I wish I could tell you that this was the last time, but these things tend to come in spurts. So we'll see how that goes. But the point is for God to receive the praise, and for that we become small, which gives us a little bit of a window into how that goes. So God is glorified in our weakness. His power is made perfect in our weakness. I feel comfort in that. And then I look at the stories like the ones that I shared to you. And it feels sort of terrifying to think, like, how in the world does that happen? There's children and young women that are dying, and I'm weak and I can't handle it. I don't see how God's strength is made perfect in that. And I still don't. And so any question of how does that happen is glib if it has this sense of this is how it happens. We will apply this to all the situations that are out there. There are some situations, however, where I can catch a small glimpse of what God might be doing. And rather than that be an explanation that I can apply across the board, it's a moment of saying, well, if I can see it here, even though I can't see it in these 5 other circumstances, maybe there is something going on there. Because I didn't see it here. I didn't think there was anything going on, but now I see that there is. And that gives me hope to sort of look at the other situations and think maybe there's also something going on there. So what could be going on? Paul talks about to keep him from becoming conceited. When I can't solve, I'm forced to wait on God to act, to trust him, and to acknowledge all that I can't do in front of everyone else. and this is an antidote for my pride. And I won't assume that all the people that are listening have as much difficulty with pride and arrogance as I do. That would be unfair to them. But there was a couple of years ago, Josiah Bancroft at a search conference, in a talk, he said, my ideas don't even seem like my ideas. They just seem like common sense. And it was this great moment of like I was like, Rachel, that's like me. I do that. And she's like, yeah, you do that. And I kept like bringing it up in various conversations because I really identified with that statement. And I was like, isn't this funny? And after about 6 months and probably 6 episodes of bringing this up, Rachel was kind of very gently saying, honey, this is true of you, but it's not actually funny. The way that you think it's funny, it can actually be quite difficult. And the reality is that my pride, my arrogance, the ways that I view myself are my tendency towards being self-centered and to feel that I need to be the solution for the problem that's in front of me is a very serious toxin and poison in all the relationships that I have. It's undoing very many good things that could be done. It needs to be renewed. It needs to be healed. And there is no better and more effective way that I can think of that taking place um, than me being shown to be weak. And in that, so what does that mean? That means that me not being able to do something which looks just like weakness in weakness, that there's a little window in how God can actually use and does use that weakness to show his strength, by cleansing our pride, by overcoming something that seems unovercomable, my prideful heart. What will ever overcome this? God uses this weakness, and you start to see it break down, I think. And that doesn't make the other areas in where I'm weak better. It doesn't answer the question of why these people have to die. But it gives me a glimpse into the mystery of what's going on in me, and gives me a reason to hope that there's more going on than what I think is going on.
Yeah, that is so powerful. I'm scanning through some of the questions that are coming in, and so let me just help us weave in some of the themes from some of the questions.
Sure.
So, one of the things I really appreciate about your book is, it really pushes us towards hope. I mean, the book really is a hopeful book. And so how do we find hope in the midst of these situations, both where circumstantially they're overwhelming, but also when we're really seeing, our weakness, our inability, our insufficiency? What does that look like? And in particular, you introduce the idea of the you catastrophe. Could you talk to the audience a little bit about that?
Sure. I have hope, and I hope that you're right, that the book comes off as hopeful. That's what people tell me, and that's what it's supposed to be. And that none of that means that I don't struggle to maintain hope on a day in and day out basis. I think it's an ongoing heart orientation struggle that we have. And honestly, the more that we look at our own weakness, the more that we face it, the less hope we have in ourselves. And so the more that we need to be having our hope in God. The promise that he gives us is that he's at work. We need to see him at work. Sometimes it can be hard to find him at work. And that's kind of where this idea of eucatastrophe sort of comes in. So eucatastrophe is a J.R.R. Tolkien coined term in his literary professorship kind of world, that he coined to sort of talk about victory snatched out of the jaws of defeat. So in the Tolkien world, this is all of the people of Middle Earth fighting against the dark armies of Mordor, and they're going to lose, and they know they're going to lose, except at the last minute the ring falls into the fire and everything crumbles, and it not only redeems and brings victory that was unexpected, but it does so in a way that makes sense of all the steps that were leading up to it. That all those things weren't irrelevant; they were actually part of it. And what Tolkien says is that the incarnation of Jesus is the eucatastrophe of history, and the resurrection of Jesus was the eucatastrophe of the incarnation. Both of these things being times in which the world looked dark and hopeless, and no one would have guessed that this amazing redemption in life was just around the corner, but it was. And when it came, it actually made sense of everything that preceded it. And so Tolkien's point is that this is what God does. This is what Christianity claims that God does, that God is a God of eucatastrophes, that and they're scattered throughout the rest of the biblical stories. And I think we need eyes to look at our own events in our lives to see such things playing out in our own lives. And again, it's this sense of if I believe, and if I have reason to believe that God is the God of eucatastrophes, then Christians have a reason to look for surprising hope. That I can't hope in this situation because nothing that I see is orienting me towards hope, except for the fact that when there's nothing that orients me towards hope, God has a habit of bringing hope. And that would be the eucatastrophe. And that's an encouragement to us in times of distress, in times of discouragement, to think that there's more going on than we can see, which we need to believe. We need to believe. And that means that hope is a gift. Um, here's a side story. When I was I was writing a book interview question thing, and it said something about how do you continue to find hope. And it was a hard day. This was just a couple weeks ago. It was a hard day. I'm sitting there. I had just learned about a number of bad patient outcomes and other things. I'm sitting there at my computer writing about how I find hope, and I'm like typing, I don't know. And right then, I get a text on my phone, and it's from a doctor who we had trained, and he had worked with us, and he's now working at another hospital. And he says, "You know that lady who was in kidney failure and was certain to die that you sent down to the Capitol? She got better, and we don't really understand how, but she went home today with normal kidney function, a young lady, like 24 years old." And not only was that incredibly encouraging to me, obviously, but the timing of it was incredible. The timing of it was like, when you do not hope, I will bring you hope as a gift. And I feel like that's how hope, as I've experienced it, sort of comes to me when I'm not looking for it. It's not a product of my optimism, and God brings it as a gift of grace, and it's hope to persevere.
No, that's great.
Long answer.
No, well, it ties together some of those threads where, the difference, I think, kind of the way that sometimes hope is talked about is kind of a little trite pie in the sky. Oh, we know that God is working all these things together, which
Right.
is true. But sometimes it's very hard in the midst of the reality. Some of the questions have referenced, different situations where they're working with people where, either in a counseling situation, change just doesn't seem possible, or very under-resourced situation where you can't provide the level of care that might be possible somewhere else. And all of those things really, as part of God's plan, push us to that place where hope starts to look different. So yeah, I think that's really well spotted on your part.
And you don't need to be living here in rural Burundi or at a developing world hospital to know that and to feel that need that we have for a durable hope.
Yeah.
We all know that. We all know that the things that everyone faces in life, especially more as we sort of try to follow Jesus into hard places, we need a real hope. We need something that actually can stand up. If it can't stand up against these hard things, then it's not what we're looking for. We need something that is stronger than ourselves.
Yeah. Well, let me combine a couple of questions. So here's one of the themes that several people have been asking about. They were expressing appreciation in your book for the way that you distinguish between lament and despair. And so the question kind of comes down to, so practically, when you find yourself in a place of despair, what can you do to be intentional about moving to a place of lament, not just remaining in a place of despair?
Yeah. This is another theme that has meant a lot to me, and it's a little bit hard to sort of jump in midstream without kind of developing what lament is and where we find it. But suffice to say that all those really uncomfortable passages in the Bible, notably in the Psalms and the prophets, have had their moments where I just thought, I'm so glad this is here. This is food for my soul to be able to have the Bible articulating emotions that I never would have guessed that it would give me. And these are laments. And so those are laments in terms of the structure, but what is lament? What is the heart of lament? What is it that makes that a lament rather than someone just complaining and despairing? And I think the question is who you're talking to. This is the most practical point that I would hone it in on. There's people that have thought about this a lot more than I have and probably have a lot better answers, but the lament be as this insistence, desperate insistence on God's existence in the middle of my lamentable situation, means that I'm taking my complaint to Him. Despair would say, there's no one to take it to, so I'm not going to bother. So despair would be kind of looking at your feet or crying out to the empty sky about what's going on. But lament, as we find it often in the Bible, is this very, very bold and brash statement of crying out to God. So one of the ones that I come back to a lot in Job 30, where Job says to God, I cry out and you do not answer me. I stand and you only look at me. I think I'm messing that up a little bit, but that's the general basis is, God, you are just looking at me and my suffering. You are not answering me. Very bold words that I've never said, although I've never suffered like Job. But the notable part being that Job is saying, you don't look at me. You're ignoring me. You're not answering me, God. You are not living up to the way that I thought you were supposed to be doing. You means that Job is addressing his complaints to God. And I think that's what characterizes in all of its, all of its rawness, what these laments are, is that the lamenter continues to address their complaint to God. Which means that this communication is open, and it means that the bridge is still being built, and it means that it is still leading us to the place where our sorrow turns into consolation. Sometimes it turns into hope or something that looks like it, where the light starts to dawn on our situation. So I think that practically speaking, whatever situation we're in, whatever words are coming out of our hearts, we direct them to God. And I think we're still on the path of lament as long as that can be said of us.
That's great. That is really helpful. Couple medical professionals who are in the audience, and their questions have centered around what drew you to work in Africa, in Burundi, in such a under-resourced area, and for other people who might consider doing something similar to that, is it worth it? What sort of difference do you tangibly feel like you're able to make?
Well, since I believe that Christ has already done everything for me, and there's nothing else that I can accomplish to change my standing before him, and that is done. And yet I still have this life in front of me that God has given me in the body and in this world. Then what am I going to do with it? I would like to glorify him with it. And given that he has given me a capacity to treat patients, to educate, to learn, I want to put those things before the Lord and try to serve him and to use him with that. And that can be done obviously in a lot of ways. But the big thing that drew Rachel and I to Africa is the magnitude of the need that's here, which not always, but oftentimes translates into a magnitude of impact that we strive to have. So the highs are highs and the lows are lows. We have so many days where, Rachel will come home, and it's so frequent that Rachel comes home having saved at least one person's life like that day. And that does not happen in American medicine on such a frequent basis. So those are the high highs. There are also tons of lows that we wouldn't have had otherwise if our setting had been different as well. Is it worth it? I hope to be able to keep doing it for a long time. So I guess I would say yes. I'm glad that God has led us where he has, and it's been a joyful thing to be a part of it. Not the type of joy that can also encompass sorrow, but it has been joyful to be a part of it.
Yeah, that's great. I'm combining a couple different questions here as well. So several questions along the lines of, what have you found helpful, to keep from getting exhausted emotionally and spiritually, or when you find yourself in that place of being overwhelmed or really exhausted by circumstances or inability, where do you go with that? I think they're really asking, talk to us a little bit about what does the heart of Eric McLaughlin look like in those circumstances?
Well, to some extent, all kind of the book chapters are sort of a response to that. I think that there are two sides to this. There's what you could call the logistical answer to that kind of question. And currently, for the medical professionals that are there, I'm sure they would all affirm that kind of the discussion surrounding physician burnout in the States and everything has kind of skyrocketed. And most of the answers to that, yeah, I'm required to sort of read them for various certification things, and they're good, are technical answers. So identify signs and symptoms of depression early on, work on workplace efficiency, try to structure the things and the processes of your life in a way that that is healthy and rewarding. And those things are good. But they don't get at kind of the other side, which is that this really is kind of a moral and theological and heart level problem in a lot of ways. And we all need a story to live out of that we believe in, that we embrace, that helps us to make sense of the things that we're encountering in our life and gives us a reason to continue on with it. So for me, I think that, what I strive to do, whether it's, stopping what I'm doing and going and praying, whether it's being reminded of these things via the family and the friends that are in my life, either afar or locally here with me, what I'm looking for and what I need is this recurrent belief that God's light is in his life are going forward, that he is true to his promises, that he's making all things new, that he's working in this situation that totally surpasses me, that he's at work, that it looks broken again, it's disappointing, I don't know how to fix it, I'm not able to fix it, is anyone able to fix it? If I can believe that God is at work, if I can see his hand at work, even a little bit, then it's kind of peeking behind the curtain. This is like a book metaphor. It's like the world can be sometimes like this big black curtain, and there's little points of light, like someone stuck a needle through different places, and there's pinpoints of light coming through. And that's not a lot of light. Mm. It's not enough light. The world on the other side can still look very dark, but what it means is that there's a world of light behind the curtain. And as long as I can see a little bit of light here, then it is a reminder to me of the greater promise of kind of what is back there.
Yeah, no, that's a great image. Well, as we get to the close of the webinar, I would love to have you, read one more story from the book. We talked about the story about Emmanuel, who comes to the hospital for treatment, and then his coming to the hospital for treatment prompts a really engaging interaction between you and your daughter.
Yeah, I can read that. Emmanuel is 10 years old. He's been in the hospital for a couple weeks. I've heard Alyssa, our team pediatrician, talk about him. He came with persistent fevers and confusion. In Burundi, two most common causes for that are severe malaria and bacterial meningitis. This boy was tested for those two things. The test didn't show anything. The tests aren't perfect. He's really sick. We're treating him anyway. But then last night, his nose starts bleeding a lot. And despite all our best efforts, it's still bleeding. Blood's on the bed. It's on his shirt. A small pile of blood-soaked scraps of cloth lie on the floor next to his bed. And for the moment, Emmanuel is laying still with his eyes closed, and his mother looks beyond exasperated. She's already spent a couple weeks caring for her intermittently confused and agitated son, and now she's passed the night caring for his profusely bloody nose. I'm pretty sure I know where this is going. I've seen it many times before. I order a complete blood count, and a little later, the results are back in, and I gather the medical students together to discuss the situation. Everything's low. His platelets are low, which is why his nose won't stop bleeding. He's severely anemic, even more than his blood loss would account for. His white blood cells are low, which makes him incredibly susceptible to any kind of infection. This condition usually happens when the body's bone marrow fails to produce the necessary parts of the blood. Well, my students have questions. What causes it? Lots of things. Can we figure out what caused it for Emmanuel? No, we can't figure that out here. The test could show the tests that could show the cause aren't that complicated, but they're not available here or anywhere else that Emmanuel could receive care.
Uh-oh. I think we might have lost Eric right at the end, which is a good time for me to remind you that you don't actually need Eric to read part of his book for you. You can get your own copy. So Eric's book is Promises in the Dark, Walking with Those in Need Without Losing Heart. It's published by our publishing partner, New Growth Press. It's available on their website, or you can find links on our website that will direct you to their website as well. One of the questions that we had centered around So what other resources might Surge have for those of us who work in hard situations and are having difficulty sustaining hope? So Eric's book is obviously a great one. One of the books that we mentioned, there'll be a link to this again in the email that we send to you, is The Mission-Centered Life, Following Jesus into the Broken Places, which is one of our new resources. We also do have 2 programs that I think could be particularly helpful, particularly if you're in a disciple-making ministry or a care counseling type ministry. One of our programs is Mentored Sonship, and so this is an intense mentoring program where we walk through gospel issues. We connect you with a trained Surge mentor, so you hear a little bit of teaching, you do some kind of inductive heart study questions, then you meet with a mentor, and everything is really focused towards what Eric was saying, you know, in that second half about what's my heart response to the suffering. Even if I can't change the circumstances, where my heart goes, God wants to be at work in that. So that's our Mentored Sonship program. And that'd be personally beneficial, I think, for you as a participant. If, on the other hand, you're responsible for training disciplers, Discipleship Lab is what we use to help train other people in kind of the same methods and content that we use in Sonship. So Eric, thanks for getting back on the line. I'm sorry that we missed the end of the reading there. Could you just tell us real briefly about the interaction with your daughter that happens as a result of what was happening with the patient?
Yeah, so my daughter, who was 4 years old at the time, we had a bedtime litany habit of asking her to, you know, if she had a sick person she wanted to pray for. And this was usually like, yes, I want to pray for myself because I have like a bug bite or something. But that night she said, I want to pray for the boy who might not get better. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, the one you and mommy were talking about at dinner. And we hadn't realized that she had been listening. And she said, what's his name? I said, well, his name is Emmanuel. That means God with us. I said, yes, it does. And I was very torn. My daughter wanted to pray for him, and I was afraid to pray for him with my daughter because I didn't think he was going to live, and she was going to ask about him, and I wasn't ready to have that conversation with her at the age of 4. But I didn't want to explain to her why I didn't want to pray for him, and so I felt a little bit like I was pigeonholed, and so we started to pray for him. And every night she would remember again, who do you want to pray for? I want to pray for the boy whose name means God with us. And a few days later, my teammate tells me that that he's doing better, that is, he stopped bleeding, that he's woken up. And about a week after that, after some bumpy ups and downs, he was able to go home against all odds. So what does that mean? I think it means hope is a gift. It means that my 4-year-old daughter may be the means by which grace comes to me and enables me to be able to hope a little more the next time something like that comes around.
Mm. What a stellar picture of both hope and God's grace to us. Eric, thanks so much for being with us. I've enjoyed it, the chat. Eric, as he was developing the ideas for the book, we had conversed back and forth. And so Eric wins the award for perseverance in publishing. This book has been a book of many different journeys, and kind of at each iteration, it's gotten more interesting, more exciting to read. So I'd encourage all of you to pick up a copy for yourselves. And then again, just real quickly, our next webinar is going to be on Monday, March 23rd with Paul Miller. I already mentioned that a little bit earlier. You'll get more information in our follow-up email, including a link to the recording of this webinar, information about other upcoming webinars, and ability to sign up for the webinar with Paul Miller, as well as a link to any of the Surge resources that we mentioned to you. Finally, if you ever want to learn more about Surge and our resources, you can always visit us at surge.org. You can find everything that we've been talking about there. It's been a joy to be with you guys. Eric, thanks again for persevering with us. It was great to be with you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks to all of you who stuck it out through 3 power outages here in Burundi. I appreciate your willingness to do that. Thanks.
There you go. All right.